Kyle, you're muted. I muted everybody. Sorry about that.
Muted me before the bell went off, so I got to try again.
Do it again.
Much more effective in person.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, we shall begin. Just real quick, open up just a moment. Any follow-on thoughts, comments, questions from the work that we've done in the first 3 days that we need to field before we get started today.
Hey, Kyle, I think it just came out. There's a new book called CASTE, C-A-S-T-E. I think it was just published yesterday. And I got through about 40% of it last night. It's all about the racial equity issue. And I think it's going to be a really important book.
All right, thank you.
It is her book of the whatever it is, month or whatever, but it's really quite well done, written by a Pulitzer Prize winner.
Yeah, I saw that in the news yesterday or today. So thanks for the heads up on that. Nice. Anything else? All right. Well, let me just quickly talk a little bit about what we're going to be up to today as we run for the finish line here in the Ideas Institute. I'll pull up my screen just briefly. And, as we've noted, today is module 4. And, today what we're going to do is be focusing on, engineering leadership in public policy. And our objectives for this session really build on work that goes back to, again, the Kansas City session, where we did a first brief pass on this. But that, what we want to do is really explore how engineers, through their civic activism, proactive engagement, et cetera, can really help be more involved in shaping public policy and leading in the civic realm. That's as opposed to a role which engineers have, played forever with regard to providing technical expertise and data and advice and executing public policy. How do engineers more fully take on that leadership role with regard to public policy? And how can engineering and science be used more effectively in that policy realm? So that's the focus in terms of that we want to have for the work this morning. Once again, in terms of the agenda, we'll start with a set of provocateurs. George Sparks from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, Steve Costello from the City of Houston. I'll give a more full introduction when we get to the provocations. And then we'll have a pair that work more as a panel. It will be a little bit more of an interview format with Carla Romero Perez and Rick Pilgrim from HDR, all of whom have been actively involved in the public policy arena through their careers, and we'll be able to sort of glimpse in what does that really look like to be leading in that realm. We'll move from there into an exercise similar to what we've done in the first 3 sessions, and here what we'll do is really take an opportunity to allow you in small groups to simulate as if you were, one of your members in the small group was going to take on a particular public policy issue or problem or whatever, and allow you to think together about how you would go about doing that. What would that look like if you were really engaged from that leadership perspective? After that exercise, we want to return once again to that reflection on current events and learning both from the COVID-19 pandemic and the Black Lives Matter anti-racism movement. What are we learning from our experience with those that could inform our thoughts about public policy? I certainly think we were beginning to edge into that discussion in our work yesterday in particular, but as well in the first 2 sessions. So that's the agenda. We'll save some time at the end for a little bit of a wrap up to the Ideas Institute overall, and be soliciting some closing comments, as well as talking a little bit about the next steps that we'll be taking from the Change Lab perspective when we get there. So that's the agenda that we're headed. Any quick thoughts or questions about that? All right, just a reminder on the logistics and ground rules. They'll be the same as we've had for the first 3 days. For the new participants, just to note, the chat function in Zoom has been a really, I think, useful and rich sort of side conversation going on. Lots of good information and resources, links that people are contributing to that and being published after the session. So we can continue to encourage people to use that. We'll be working with the dual screen. So hopefully you both, at this point, everybody who's been here knows the routine, but again, for the new folks, we'll be working with the Zoom screen for the portion of the interaction, but we'll also be having people run that Google Doc off to the side, which will be our shared flip chart for working the session. Just as a note, if we've got technical difficulties, Joe Blacksbeard is available to help with that. So with that, I'm going to end my screen share and introduce the first of our provocateurs, who's George Sparks. Now, George, actually, this is his second time being a provocateur with our group. George is the president and CEO of the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. We had the pleasure, and it really was a pleasure, to have the museum host our session, or our summit number 4 in Denver, which made just a great setting for amongst the dinosaurs and tours down into the crypt to play Indiana Jones and things down there. It was a really great experience in doing that. But as well, George was, giving us a provocation at that point centered on looking at the intersection of nature and science, or nature and technology, and introduced us to what has become one of my favorite books, a book called The Wizard and the Prophet, and ideas around that. Importantly, inside the museum, George was set up through his leadership a Institute for Science and Policy as a major program for the museum. And it really has that focus of science, engineering, and public policy. And we thought it would be an absolute natural to ask him back to this session to share his perspective about that engagement that we're talking about, and thoughts around the realm of public policy, both drawn from his experience with that institute, but more broadly through his career in terms of what the work that he's done. We'll note he's an aeronautical engineer in terms of his background. And so with that, George, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you pull up your screen share.
Thanks, Kyle. Let's take a look at this here. See if we can get this to work. Okay. So after, let's see here. Okay, I'm not getting it to move here. Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, we hear you, George.
Yeah, it's not, I might need some help here. It's not.
Go and maybe pull it back up on the screen.
Oh, there we go. Okay, got it now. Okay, so the Institute for Science and Policy,
Hey,
we started.
George, sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt. Your screen share is not on.
Oh, it's not. Okay. Let's try this again here. Can you see that?
There.
Yes.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Now we're all set. So when President Trump was elected, there was a lot of talk about a war on science. We had a march for science, and I believe that you can't have a war on science any more than you can have a war on math. They're both going to end in the long run. You can disregard science and math, but you're not going to win in the long run. It always ends in tears, and I think we're seeing that at this time in around COVID. So we decided to start the Institute for Science and Policy. And the goal of the Institute for Science for Policy is to provide a platform for people to have collaborative dialogue around science and policy, and to begin to work on issues in a safe environment, and help create a group of people that understand that public policy. Science is really important to making good public policy. And when I say science, I use the word science and engineering equally here. So you can put engineering, you can put reason, whatever you'd like to do. We started off as a convener. We get people together to talk about issues. We want to eventually become an honest broker, and that's where we'll get a group of people together to discuss a topic and present policymakers with 2 or 3 different alternatives with the pluses and minuses of those. But we're always going to stay on the left-hand side of this spectrum here. We're not going to move to where we become an advocate. And many nonprofit organizations are advocates. They say, here's the answer, but this is what we want you to do, and they lobby for that. And we certainly don't want to become a partisan, which is what passes for dialogue these days on CNN and Fox News. And we've been really pretty successful here as convener and honest broker. We've done things like we had a couple symposia around some of the topics that Kyle talked about. We started a lunch bunch with 5 CEOs from the oil and gas business and 5 CEOs from the environmental community. And we met for a year and had lunch and built trust and started to learn about each other's businesses. So we're really happy with where it's going now. I'm going to offer you some of the insights that we've gotten from this. If it's still not. Let's do that. Okay, we'll try it that way. Okay, so as you think about this, policy is all about power. It's how do you exert power to create some public good? And that power, being an engineer, you have to put it in some sort of an equation. It's really about people and place. How do you get the people to buy into the fact that that you're helping them set a policy? And then how do you get them to follow the policy? And I put place in there, especially because of of climate change. I think that's probably our biggest policy issue right now. And as we've seen in COVID and in climate change, people can react in many different ways to this idea of policy equaling power. And if you don't believe that, you've never been on the board of a homeowners association. This is the ultimate test of policy, because you have to understand what people's needs are and get them to buy into it. And eventually, if you do a good job of that, they will allow you to exert power over them and their place. So today, people grant their trust, and trust is the prerequisite to all this. They won't give you the authority to create policy, or they won't follow the policy unless they have trust in you. And there's 2 distinct attributes of that. The first one is competence. And all of us on this call today, from the very first time in math class when somebody said, gosh, you're pretty good at math, you should be an engineer. Or when you took apart your mom's vacuum cleaner and you thought, this is kind of fun, I might want to do this for a living. All of our education has been about credentialing ourselves and building competence, technical competence for our craft. Turns out the thing on the right, doing the right thing and working to improve society, is just as important to people rewarding you with trust and allowing you to create good public policy. My wife is a surgeon, and she spent 20 years learning the stuff on the left, and we get almost no training on the things on the right. And I really applaud ECL for the way that you're going after this. There's a lot of reasons we've lost faith in government. I don't have to read through these things here. The 2 that are most notable for me are the bottom ones down there: economic inequality and economic mobility. I think we're seeing that in the COVID experience right now. The Institute has done 13 webinars in partnership with the Colorado School of Public Health, and we did 2 about the racial inequity in COVID. And we got some quite interesting responses from people. I think a lot of people did not believe that COVID was affecting people of color and people who at the lower end of the income scale more profoundly than it was others. So, but those are things that are happening today. So why might the public distrust engineers? You got the 737 MAX thing where they created a new flight control system, and the engineers who were in positions of power decided that they made a mistake on how much they were going to train the pilots, and 2 plane loads of people paid for it in their lives. And Facebook, these algorithms are increasingly becoming more controversial, more powerful. I'm not sure anybody in Facebook besides the people who wrote the code know what those algorithms do, but it's getting more and more publicity. And you always hear scientists are changing their mind. The most current one is the World Health Organization. When we talked about coronavirus, you can't get it from asymptomatic people. And then literally the next morning, they came back and said, well, we don't know. And now they're saying, yes, you can. And the classic one is the masks. Originally, we advised you not to wear a mask. What they didn't say was, we're advising you this because we don't want to cause a run on medical masks, but that part was sort of lost in the media. And then they decided to go ahead and that masks were important. Turns out masks really are effective, but I think they kind of spoiled the rollout there in the way that they did that. And then finally, science can become politicized. On the left, you see some of the protests in Denver. In Denver, at least, we heard nary a word about talking about protesters getting together and the problem with them not wearing masks, et cetera. They were doing something, quote unquote, noble. However, when Trump wanted to hold a rally, everybody came out and said, gosh, this is a public health threat. We shouldn't do that. I think that was a fundamental mistake on the part of the scientific and policy community. So once you gain trust, trust isn't enough because, we're all like people in a bar. And even though the people that you go to your local bar with, they may trust you, but they certainly don't agree with you all the time. So how do you influence people to accept your proposals with respect to public policy? They may trust you, but they certainly may not agree with you. And this is one of my favorite diagrams, and it's called the road to science. And you could say the road to engineering or reason or whatever back there. Each one of us are flawed human beings. We as engineers and scientists like to say, oh, well, we're scientists. We don't have biases, and we obviously have the best interest of society at heart here. And that's simply not the case. So imagine you're driving your tractor trailer full of stuff down to the city of science here, and you get it caught in these cul-de-sacs of our biases, our values, and our self-interest. And there are countless biases. Here's my favorite one right now because of COVID, the Dunning-Kruger bias. And it says, if you know a little bit about something, you're way overconfident about how much you know. You see this a lot today about people. I read something on the internet and gosh, what you're saying, is it true? Or climate change, I know this guy that told me this. And I love this one about the guy that wants to take over from the pilot here. The most famous one is confirmation bias, and that's obviously one that we all struggle with a lot. Talk about values. The very best example of this playing out over and over and over again is the kneeling sports figures. Here's another book. This is the most important book I've ever read. Kyle said that I introduced him to a really good one. This was a really important book. And you can see from the subtitle why it's particularly important today. Dr. Haidt has created a moral foundation framework that is basically a spectrum. And on one end of the spectrum, each one of us put a certain weight around things like caring and fairness. And on the other end of the spectrum, we put emphasis around things like sanctity and authority. And every one of us believes in these things to a certain degree and puts different weight on it. And the football players are kneeling because they think caring and fairness are most important. They want to make a point. And the fans and the people on the sidelines are saying, no, we believe in sanctity and authority of our flag. And turns out they're both right, but they're not talking to each other. They're certainly not listening to each other. They're talking to each other. I highly recommend this book. It's really has changed my life, the way I think about people. And to some extent, we're born with these characteristics. The last one and the hardest one is self-interest. And we can get past our biases and our values, but it's really, really hard to get around our self-interest. And climate change is the big one. I know a lot of oil and gas folks. I grew up in southern West Virginia in a coal mining town. And, coal miners are good people. They may actually understand climate change, but by golly, there is really nothing else to do in those towns except mine coal. And it's really hard for them to accept the science around climate change when they know that if it's true, they're going to be out of a job. So how does public policy get made when trust is gone? And you have to go around all these things like our biases and our values. Here's obviously the COVID originally, had a few hot spots and everybody thought the first wave was past, and now we're back into either the end of the first wave or the beginning of the second wave. I think this is fascinating how, depending on who's in power, from a political point of view, you have more faith in the government. You can see back in the Bush and the Reagan years, the Republicans had higher faith in government than the Democrats did. And Obama came into power, it flipped, and now in Trump, it's flipped again. However, it's pretty low in any case. It's, during the Obama years, the Republicans only had faith in government only 10% of the time. And now they've moved all the way up to 30% of the time. But this is a really big problem if you're trying to make public policy. And how do you get engaged in public policy as scientists or engineers? And you can see here that, again, once again, there's a partisan divide about whether people believe we as technicians are better or worse at making policy decisions that involve our technology or our science. You can see here, Republicans tend to be a little more skeptical about both our expertise and about whether or not we should actually be engaged in these things right here. So I think that's something you need to take into account when you're dealing with this. I love this diagram because we as scientists, engineers say, gosh, if you just knew what I know, the policy would be self-evident. And that is clearly not the case, because we always have to go through the political process to make good public policy. We have to deal with all those people issues of creating trust and helping people understand what we're trying to do here and getting them to buy into the process. If we don't do that, we create a process, and maybe it's technically correct, but nobody's going to follow it. So as part of this, you have to change people's minds. And I'm going to ask you to think about this, and I'd like you to report at the end of the session today, when was the last time that you changed your mind on anything really substantive? And I suspect most of you are sitting back there thinking, I must have done it once or twice. The example for me is plastic bags at the grocery store. I would rant and rave that, by golly, I deserve a bag at the grocery store. And I can prove to you that the volume of plastic bags that they give out at the grocery store is minuscule compared to any other pollutant in the country. But over time, I have changed my mind. And what changed it was microplastics, because I didn't see a huge problem with plastic bags blowing around town. But once they devolve into microplastics, they do get into water supply and eventually do get in and affect our health. So, but it took me literally years to change my mind on that topic. So how do you do that when you're working with people to create good public policy? And this is a really important statement, because it's not about the facts. It's not the data. It's not the facts. Tamar Haspel is a columnist for the Washington Post. She's been a speaker for us. And I think this quote of hers really says it all, that you have to approach each other as human beings in order to persuade people to change their mind. So I call this people-centered policy creation. And the idea is that you're going to have to engage with the people that are going to be affected by your policy. You have to engage early and have an ongoing strategy. Today, we have a low-income area in Denver where the National Western Center is going to be putting $2 billion of development into this. And we've been having meetings with the community for 5 years now, every single week for 5 years. We've gotten them to be part of the authority. We meet with, 30 or 40 people every single week for 5 years. And that's because trust and relationships take time. People down there in that neighborhood have been screwed so many times. The most notable one being I-70. I-70 plowed through their neighborhood 60 years ago and basically cut their neighborhoods in half. So imagine the neighborhood that you live in, that the government came and said that we're going to put a freeway through your neighborhood. You're probably going to take a long time to rebuild trust. This idea about values, almost everybody can find common ground around values. It's a great place to start on this. I think the most important thing here is just to be human, to listen to each other, because we're all flawed. We all have biases. Learn to listen, especially people that you disagree with. I think if you merely can see the other people as human beings and listen to them, then you're most of the way there toward creating some trust.
So
And
George, this is your time check.
okay, got it. Thank you, Kyle.
3-4 minutes.
Okay. This idea of humility, be curious, intellectually humble. And it turns out all of this can be really fun if you decide this is the way you want to go about it here. And I think Roger Pilkey Jr., who's a climate scientist up at CU, said it best that science, and I added engineering, are a wonderful way of describing the natural world if applied with humility. So my charge to you is to go out and engage in the public discourse, see each other as fellow human beings, realize that we're all flawed and that you are part of the process of bringing them along, and that you can actually learn new skills and have a lot of fun doing it. So with that, I'll wrap it up, and here's some of the links to the Institute. If you want to be engaged on this, we're going to have a virtual symposium this fall, so we'll have unlimited seats. We're going to do it after the election, and it will be about how do we restore the trust of science and public policy. So thank you.
Great, George. Thank you very much for that, for those thoughts. A couple things that stood out for me, and links to past work here. The issue of trust in engineers is really a fascinating one. In terms of the potential there. Beth Cady, who's I think with us this morning, one of her studies or one of the pieces that she brought forward to us back in Kansas City was a fairly remarkable observation that came out of a survey that the NAA did about the public's attitude toward engineers. And we've said it a couple times inside the Change Lab, but when they surveyed attitudes of adults with regard to engineering a number of years ago, what they found is that most adults don't think that engineers care about societal concerns or improving the quality of life, and that almost half believe that engineers invent products that actually harm people and society. Over half. Mm. And so this trust, even though engineers are, in my view, in a central position where they could, in fact, practice George's observation about people-centered policy creation. They could engage with those communities around their work. This issue of trust is such an important one, and how that gets addressed in order to enable that engagement with public policy. So great talk, George. Why don't we go next to Steve Costello? And in his talk, you'll actually, I suspect, hear enacted some of the themes that George was putting on the table with his discussion of shaping and enacting public policy. Steve Costello is, currently the Chief Recovery Officer for the City of Houston, and that recovery really speaks to focusing on the recovery coming from Hurricane Harvey. But I think more particularly, you can almost think about it, the other way I think of his title is he's, a central responsibility with regard to building the resilience of Houston. So it's just not recovery from that one hurricane event, but, really building the resilience to allow the city and the region to recover quickly from future things that are going to occur. He comes, with a background in engineering, had his own engineering firm. Our history of knowing Steve's great work with regard to public policy starts with conversations with Edwin Friedrichs, who's on our steering committee here at UCL, and work that Edwin and Steve and several others initiated a decade ago in a program called Renew Houston, which I think Steve will talk just briefly about. And the work that they accomplished in that, a very small set of engineers, I think starting at less than half a dozen of them, that started that initiative, has caused me at least to put Edwin and Steve up in my pantheon of engineering leaders. in terms of people that really exhibit what the best of engineers can do when they lead in the public realm. So really pleased to have Steve with us, and I'll turn it over to him for his talk. Thank you.
Okay, does everybody hear me now?
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're good, Steve. You're good.
Okay,
Thanks.
great. Kyle, thank you for that introduction. And George, I really appreciate your presentation. It's actually perfect for me to follow right behind what you have presented. My graphics is very simple because I realize you guys have been through a lot for the past couple of days in terms of presentations. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about the transition of an engineer from what we are normally called as nerds. You know, people, there's always a joke about engineers. How do you know an engineer? Well, that person is looking at your shoes. And so this transition from being an engineer, nerd, limited communication skills, to a transition into becoming an industry expert, subject matter expert, to then ultimately becoming an advisor and or a policymaker. And I think it's important to recognize the fact that it doesn't take a unique person to do what I have done. It just takes a commitment, and obviously there's a lot of support in terms of trying to go through this transition. So this presentation is really more about how I started as an engineer, my personal story, and then I'm going to offer a challenge to the participants that are actually in this particular Zoom. Next. So if you go to the next slide, Joe. So, you know, a lot of people talk about what we do. You know, who are we? What do engineers do? Well, you know, our profession says health, safety, and welfare. And what we do is we're designing infrastructure to improve quality of life. Well, a lot of people don't really appreciate or really grasp what the term infrastructure means. And it's really about how we communicate to the public. And if you think about what George was talking about in terms of trust, a lot of that has to do with communication. And unfortunately, in our industry, we as engineers and scientists sometimes take the position that we know more than they do. And it's unfortunate because even politicians believe that as well. But what people don't recognize is that even people who just have a college, don't even have a college education, are smart. They understand life, they understand issues. And we have to be able to boil down what we're trying to advocate for and to say this is what is really needed in terms of policy. So if you go to, let's say, so as we're talking about infrastructure, a lot of problems that I see and what I've heard over the years is that the public says to us, or even the political leaders say to us, well, you're just self-serving, you know, because obviously you're going to be the entity or the engineer that's going to design it. You're going to make money and profit off of it. And my first reaction to that type of statement is, well, do you have that same feeling when you're in the doctor's office and the doctor says that you need to have a surgery procedure? You're not going to turn to that doctor and say, well, you're just going to make money off of me. I don't want you to do it. You know, and I say to them, I says, well, I'm a drainage engineer and I design roads and drainage. You don't want me to operate on your teeth if you need the teeth extracted. And I don't want a dentist designing your road. And so it's all about how we communicate to the public to gain public trust. Let's go to the next slide, Joe. So what I was trying to figure out how best to describe infrastructure. And I went on to Google, and this was one of the definitions that I found. And obviously, we as engineers understand everything that's written here, exactly. But let's go down to the last paragraph, and you can see the term capital extensive, high cost investment. I think an easier term is expensive. And then you go to the term countries functioning. That's really quality of life. And then you go to the next term, economic development and prosperity. That's really job creation. And what we have to learn as engineers is how to boil down an issue and to make it more knowledgeable, make it more acceptable, make it not really simplified, but in common terms that people can understand and appreciate and grasp. This is where this issue of public trust comes about. And it's extremely important that we work on that. That is why a lot of times you're seeing now agencies, both the city of Houston, I see it in some of the other agencies in Harris County, Texas, where we're engaging in a public relations firm to help us give our message to the community. Every time we're working on a project, what George was just talking about, meeting with a neighborhood over what you're trying to do in that neighborhood. Well, we're now engaging public relation firms to help us make that message. And we should do a better job of ourselves as engineers to spend time in messaging. If you go back to engineering curriculum, I remember, I'm 67 years old as of yesterday. I never had a communication course as part of a prerequisite of my engineering college education. I mean, there are certain things that we need to do now. Yes, we are STEM-oriented type people, but we need to be more well-rounded. And communication and writing skills are extremely important in the development of our future engineers to be able to communicate with the general public and to gain that public trust. Let's go to the next slide, please. So I printed this out, and this is really kind of interesting. This is ASCE's grade for infrastructure. And on the left side is the national grade. On the right side is the state of Texas grade. And now we're soon to get their next upgrade, which in January of 2021, ASCE will put out another grade. I assume that it's either going to be this grade level or below. And the real question is, as we talk to the public, is that a good grade? Well, no, it's not a good grade. And yet we, while we're raising our children and our grandkids, and we see grades like that, we don't accept that. And yet here we are on our national infrastructure, our state and local infrastructure, accepting those types of grades. And that's why I think as an engineer, one of the reasons why I got involved in politics was because of this particular issue. It's the fact that we're not investing in our community. There's an old political saying that we, the generation of today, are the generation of users. That we are using the infrastructure that was built by generations before us, and we're not willing to or have the political will to invest in infrastructure, to replenish it, to make it sustainable and resilient for the next generation. And that's a poor label for us to have right now. And that's why I think one of the reasons why I got involved in it. There's another issue as we relate to that. So let's go to the next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about my personal story first, before I get into what I want to challenge the audience about. So I'm going to go back to 2009. And I was part of the trade association, American Council of Engineering Companies, the Houston chapter. And we were standing around, there was a group of 30 to 35 business owners locally in Houston sitting around discussing why the city is not investing in infrastructure, that we really need to get things done. And we decided that the only way we can accomplish that is if we have someone on council who can have the bully pulpit to have that discussion. But first, what we had to do is we had to define the problem. We knew what the problem was, but we had to figure out a way to get the message to the public of what the problem was. So what we did in 2008, leading up to 2009, was we did a series of polls, and we asked the question of what the public perceived was the most critical part of Houston in terms of society, what they really wanted. And our first series of polls came out that public safety was the #1 issue on the mind of the public. However, in polling, it's all about how you ask the question. It's not really the specific question. And so what we decided to do is we took another poll and we modified the asking of the question. And after the second poll, our infrastructure investment kind of went up in ranking. We went to another poll, and finally we ended up coming up with the right message that had infrastructure, particularly drainage and flooding, at the same level as public safety. So knowing now what we had was the right question that we were posing, we were sort of fine tuning a message in terms of delivering what we wanted to do to the public. And then what we decided to do is, okay, here we were, 30 or 35 of us in June, July of 2009, leading up to a November election for city council. And we said, okay, the only way we can effectively get this message is to be one of us be on council. And I was actually leading that discussion, unfortunately. And I asked someone, okay, who's willing to volunteer to be that person? Knowing that we were going to have a sacrifice. No one volunteered. So I did, unfortunately, really. And so, but what I did tell them, I said, okay, if I'm volunteering to run for political office, you have to make sure I don't lose. And what that meant is that there was a commitment on the part of the engineering community to help one of their members to get on council. Why is that important? Because there's an old political adage, if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. And so we wanted to be at the table to start setting up public policy. And as Kyle has said, what our goal was and why we did those polls prior to 2009 was we had identified a problem, and the problem was a lack of infrastructure investment in flooding and drainage. And we created a program. There was 4 of us having dinner one night, and yes, it was truly on the back of a napkin. We created a 20-year program, $6 to $8 billion of investment. And what it was to convince the public that if you're willing to invest a small amount of money on a monthly basis, we can rebuild our infrastructure over a 20-year period. And it was really an interesting process because we were leading up into the national election in 2010. So I did win my election. And so I get on council. So I'm one of 9 council members, plus the mayor. And so we went to the mayor and we said, Mayor, we have a program that we think the public will agree. And the mayor said to us, well, I want you to get the public to vote on it, which means it was going to go on a November ballot during a national election. And if you recall back in 2010, this was the big push by the Republican Party of limited government, limited investment. And they had a huge successful election in 2010. And yet we were able to pass a $6 to $8 billion program where we were charging the public to help us invest in it. And it was a pay-as-you-go program. So we were telling the public, we're going to deviate from the standard bonding to finance infrastructure to a pay-as-you-go program. And we were very successful with that. So it was kind of interesting how we worked to get that done. The other thing that I thought was kind of interesting, if we go to the next slide, this was one that was very frustrating for me. I took this down off the internet, and what don't you see here? You don't see our profession. And it was really kind of thought-provoking to me was, why don't we see us there? And a lot of it has to do with infrastructure and the general public and how they perceive infrastructure in our profession. When they flush the toilet, when they turn on the water, when they drive down the street and the traffic light's not working. I mean, they take a lot of things for granted now. And we, as a profession, do not spend a lot of time advocating for the things that we are doing for the public. Because number one, it's very hard to talk about yourself. And number two, when we do talk about our profession, it's always perceived to be self-serving. And so, but the interesting thing is, when I talk to people, even in the political world, or even in the general public, there is a great deal of trust in our profession. It's just there's a lack of communication in terms of what we do. And I'll give you a case in point. When I got on council in 2010, I was the only engineer on council. In fact, I was the first engineer ever to be on city council in the city of Houston, which is really kind of concerning at first. But for the first year on council, every one of my colleagues came to me when it came to infrastructure, when it came to public works activities. They really have trust in our profession. And it was kind of interesting and I guess kind of rewarding that it was happening that way. So it was very interesting. So let's go to the next one. Next slide. Here's the depressing part. the number of engineers in federal government that make policy. I was really surprised to see that. Go to the next slide, Joe. Here it's even worse. This is the number of engineers, state of Texas, in terms of the Senate and the House. Go to the next slide. This is City Council, City of Houston. And you say to yourself, that is unbelievable. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that we don't have our members that really could and really be an effective role in terms of moving policy forward. And I bring this up because
I'm going to give you your time check for 3 or 4 minutes.
Sure. So if you think about it, the most influential policy that we have as engineers is on the local level. And we really need to focus on the local level and getting our engineers involved. That is why there's a book that was written by a gentleman by the name of Bruce Katz and Jennifer Bradley, and it's called The Metropolitan Revolution. And it's about how cities are now taking a more important role in moving and advancing forward the improvements to society. So this last slide, which is the one that's most important, and this is the challenge that I'm focusing to everybody. Joe, if you go to the last slide. We need to build a bank. We need to build our bench. And the only way to do that is to recruit people to run for political office, to get them at the table so that we're not on the menu, to continue to build public trust, and to continue to work on policies for infrastructure. These are 4 agencies, these are 4 groups that are actually doing that. And the Victory Fund is an advocate for LGBT candidates. It was created in 1991, the organization. Annie's List, women candidates, primarily progressive, started in 2003. Emily's List, women candidates, Democrats, pro-choice, started in 1985. 314 Action is scientific and STEM candidates, but they started in 2016. How come we don't have that? How come we don't have a group that specifically recruits candidates to run for political office? And what all these agencies group, all these 4 groups do is they recruit, they train, they fundraise, they put together their teams. Why can't we do that? And I think as an organization, as engineers, that's something that we need to seriously consider about. And as I was putting this proposal together, this presentation together, I got to this slide. And after thinking about it a while, I said to myself, why don't I try to do that? So you can see, I mean, it's an issue that's important to all of us in terms of advocating for our profession, in terms of improving infrastructure, and really in terms of improving the quality of life of citizens in general. So my challenge to you is to seriously consider stepping out from your comfort zone, rather than sitting behind the office or behind your computer working on some type of project, and think about how you can add to society and be that bully pulpit to help us advance the cause of improving the quality of life of the general public. I'll end there. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Steve. I wonder, Steve, if I can ask you one question or have you reflect on one aspect of your Renew Houston story. And my memory of it, based on conversations with Edwin and over the years, is that during the process of running the ballot initiative and trying to get that, you know, have a successful election for that, and we were talking about trust, is that there was a particular set of interactions that you as engineer leaders had to have with the low-income minority areas within Houston in order to build trust with them. Am I remembering that right?
I do. I do.
And could you speak to, you know, that dynamic, because I think it talks about, you know, your point about communication and engagement and building trust in a little micro capsule there.
Yeah, so it was interesting as we were building and putting together our campaign team this was right after I was elected, so I was a city official. And we were putting together the campaign from February of 2010 to the November election in 2010. As we were building the coalition, we actually got a call from the African American community. And so we went to visit a number of leaders. They had put together a group of leaders, and they spent the first hour yelling at us and giving us a lecture over the fact that, you know, they have a significant role in these types of initiatives, that their communities would be affected both adversely and advantage-wise. So adversely, obviously, the monthly expenditure that people are going to have to pay for the infrastructure investment, but to benefit the communities, because a lot of their communities are underserved communities. And they figured that if there's enough funds, that the city will be investing in that community. And if it's interesting when you go back and look at the results of the voting that occurred in November. Now we won, I think we won 50.1 versus 49.9. That's how close the election was. And you go back and look at precinct by precinct, the African American community passed this initiative for us. And that's true. And so it's all about embracing everyone who could be involved in helping you pass an initiative. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that here we were, a bunch of engineers putting together a political initiative and putting together a political team. And a lot of times, none of us really knew what to do. I mean, we had no idea how you get all these coalitions put together. What we were able to do was define the problem. We were able to define the message, and we were able to raise money. But we didn't know how to run a political campaign. And some of these community leaders knew how to run a political campaign, and they also knew how to get the message out to the public. So it was very, very helpful for us to do that. I think the other thing that was so unique about Rebuild Houston, and well, I'll tell you what was frustrating about Rebuild Houston. When we got it passed, so we got it passed in 2010, it really started actually in fruition in early 2011. We thought it would be an incredible program to march across the entire country on how we were able to get the community at large to pass a $6 to $8 billion program. And so we went before the national group, the American Council of Engineering Companies, and asked if we could make a presentation at one of their national meetings. And really we did, and we got very little acceptance or even inquiries as to, hey, tell us more about that. Because we thought that any state, any municipality could look at our business model and give it a try and really help raise money and investments in their infrastructure. And so it's, you know, looking back at it right now, I'm still a little puzzled why we didn't have more agencies or more groups sort of embrace our business model. But we're always here to help.
Okay. Well, as I said at the introduction to you, Steve, you know, the group of four that were, you know, on doing that napkin sketch, you know, really are in my pantheon of engineer leaders because of the work that you did with that initiative. And in particular, knowing the story, one of the things in your description of sort of just now in terms of how you had to engage with the African American community was that the group of you were humble enough to realize that you didn't know how to do a bunch of this stuff and that you were willing to learn. And that I think that learning mentality in each step as you went through the process, that willing to stay in that learning mode in order to advance you know, the work that you wanted to do was just terrific.
Yeah,
so,
and I
so
think,
thanks for that. Oh,
yeah,
go ahead.
Kyle, I think also one of the things that was very effective was I was a council member. And while the other three members were out meeting groups, I was able to go out with the bully pulpit every evening and go to community members, go to community groups, go to super neighborhoods and talk about it. And so you still need that someone sitting at the table to be able to have some credibility in advancing that program.
All right. Well, thanks, Steve, for offering that. So we're going to take a short 5-minute break, one of our mini breaks, and then we'll come back and we've got two people that will be doing a co-provocation, really more of an interview format. I have some questions for them. and we'll introduce them and go into our third part of the provocations when we get back from this mini break. So 5 minutes, please. I've got let me introduce our next two provocateurs, and they're going to be working in tandem rather than us working in series here. And I think they work as close colleagues and have a particular perspective, working within the Denver region on the public policy area that we wanted to highlight with regard to this provocation. The two provocateurs, first is Carla Romero Perez. She's a senior strategic consultant with HDR in Denver. Carla comes with a background in public administration and has worked in the realm of public administration with both public agencies and inside private consulting firms for 30 years, shaping public policy and engaging in public affairs from that perspective, with a heavy emphasis with regard to transportation policy in her work. Rick Pilgrim is the Transportation Market Development Director for HDR. And Rick's background as a transportation engineer, extends to leading that sector with HDR and work across the board with regard to different types of transportation work, from the roads and bridges to maritime stuff to aviation, et cetera. Sort of the full spectrum there. Beyond his work, on the technical side and the leadership of transportation projects, from a consulting engineering practice, Rick has also been deeply engaged with regard to public policy from an elected official standpoint. He was the mayor of his community outside of Denver for 10 years, and during that period of time served as chair of the Metro Mayor's Caucus and other sort of collaborative mechanisms in the Denver region. I will note, as Steve Costello mentioned, this book, The Metropolitan Revolution, which I agree is a great read that came out of the Brookings with Bruce Katz and Jennifer Bradley as the authors. One of the principal stories that shows up in The Metropolitan Revolution is about Denver and the evolution of work at the metropolitan level to solve particular infrastructure challenges that they were faced, and how they moved from the metropolitan region being a series of fiefdoms that didn't cooperate to an integrated community that could get things done. And interestingly enough, Rick, during his tenure, was right in the middle of that. And so good work from him. So that's the tee up to the two provocateurs. Maybe before we get into my questions and we pull up the slideshow that you want to offer, just a few thoughts on slides. Carla and Rick, you each want to just quickly fill in a little bit more detail in terms of your personal background and introduction. So maybe Carla, start with you.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you for the opportunity to participate today. And it is of particular interest to me, being a non-engineer in this conversation, but having spent my entire career working with both engineers and elected officials, sort of filling in that space in between and looking at those opportunities to share the background. So I have worked both in the Colorado legislature as nonpartisan staff. I have been the policy director at CDOT, and when there was the first policy director at CDOT, where I was the first woman and public policy person actually in a position of influence within the organization. But I have found it very valuable going back and forth between the public and the private sector in terms of understanding the differences, in terms of how you influence policy and how you make policy in both of those different environments. So I think this is a great thing that that ECL is doing in terms of being able to have this conversation with folks and really expand that understanding.
All right, thanks, Carl. And Rick?
Well, I've had the distinct honor and pleasure to work with Carla for more than 20 years. We're sort of kindred spirits in trying to make a difference here in the Denver region. And so we'll touch on that here with a couple of visuals in a minute. I just have to compliment Engineering Change Lab and the work that you're doing to make a difference. Steve, your comments were terrific. George, you live here in Denver, so you're a contributing member to solutions. And Lauren Evans is a longtime friend. I got to work with her on a couple of projects here in the Denver region. And so engineers can make a difference. And, you know, I call myself a plan engineer because I like the front end where the decisions are made. That's a lot more interesting than trying to design a bridge. I could design a bridge for you, but you could never afford it. So.
All right. Well, thanks, Carla and Rick. You know, first, you know, I think we wanted to start off with just an opportunity for both of you to share some of your, you know, initial insights with the group about, you know, engineers and engaging more fully in the public policy arena. And so I think you wanted to pull up just a few slides to jointly talk through while we do that. So do you, Rick, I guess you're in charge of the slideshow?
Yeah, we'll see if we can actually make this work.
Looks good.
We got, okay, success. Well, again, I wanted to compliment everybody and try to, Carla and I want to try to draw together a number of the things that people have presented and we've talked about over the last 3 sessions and into today. So when we talk about that, there is a framework in the policy arena. A couple of the readings that we had that were sent out in advance of the summit were Dr. Chris Tyler, British Office of Science and Technology. There's more to policy than scientific evidence, and he goes on to say that policy is designed implementation of an intervention, while politics is the process or how that decision was made. Peter Gluckman, the New Zealand Chief Science Advisor, and George, we are agreeing with you. Science does equal engineering in this framework. Science for policy is different than policy for science. Science or engineering can be advising policy and how that's made. But policy sets the programs to administer engineering. So there's that distinction that's important to keep in balance. It does, potentially come to that potential conflict of interest and a loss of influence because of what Steve was talking about. The fact that the surgeon is going to make money when they operate on you. Well, aren't the engineers going to make money? Well, yes, but we have an ethical reason to do that. And so when one looks at the Engineering Code of Ethics, the fundamental canons, and Steve, you succinctly summarized that as health, safety, and welfare. I think that at our core, engineers really believe that, and we move forward with that. Carla, did you have a comment you wanted to make here?
No, keep going.
Okay. Well, how about trust? Carla, you wanted to make a couple of comments on trust.
Yeah, so I think that in here, and George talked a little bit about this in his slides, that trust in government has clearly been declining over time, and there's a whole host of reasons for that. And that is something that I think we deal with when many of the decisions that are made, and largely in the infrastructure arena, do come from our governmental officials. So that is whether it's the investment in it or how to proceed forward, and what the policy agendas are. So that's something that I think we need to be very cognizant of. And much of that trust is also shaped by the increase in social media, mass media. This bullet here about 2/3 of Americans get their news from social media. I think 2/3 of Americans get information from social media, and how much of it is actual news, which is supposed to be fact-based and non-biased, I think has really changed and been difficult over the years for people to really be able to ascertain what the difference is between truth and not. Looking, I think this one, Rick, was something that you were specifically going to talk about, but it really does get into how that is affecting the way people make decisions. And the graph on the side, which talks about the social media, it's also generational. I know that I find this even in my own family. I had my daughter come to me, I think it was just last year, where she was going through some of her social media posts, and she was saying, how do I know what news is accurate or what's not? Right. And I think that as generations, we struggle with what is it that we really use as our information and whether or not we know it's true. So it makes it challenging, I think, when we're trying to talk about public policy or when we read about scientific things online. And it really also speaks to how much of public opinion in many ways really influences the scientific material that we see out there. And how we accept it.
Well, George and Steve both touched on the trust in science and engineering. You know, you can look at a number of different statistics, and Pew Research really has done a terrific job on trying to understand the American population in general. And I would say, you know, 6 in 10 in the US say scientists should take an active role in policy debates, still understanding that line of influence versus self-interest is a pretty important thing to keep track of. We thought it was quite interesting. Iana, for example, talked about engineering leadership. And a lot of that has to do with the responsibility of engineers and architects, scientists in our profession, both globally and socially. Darshan, you talked about activist engineering, which really to us is about awareness, the self-reflection for activist engineering. Engenders a number of questions that we should be asking of ourselves and how to engage. Engagement is really the actuation of that understanding, that awareness. Jen talked about that relative to sustainability. And Brian Sifton gave us a framework to anticipate, to cope, and then to adapt as we go forward in building that trust, collaboration, and cross-cultural learning. Just a little more on Carla and Rick through the years. This goes back to 1999. We were co-chairs at the Denver Metro Chamber. And then Carla went on to be a governmental affairs consultant. I've always been in the engineering business or engineering, working on projects. But each of us, as you can see there, we've been engaged in a variety of different places so that we could have influence on what's happening. One of the success stories, Fast Tracks Yes, which was a half-cent sales tax that was enacted region-wide to build about a $7 billion transit system. And then Carla, you most recently, you've been trying, well, we've all been trying to increase transportation funding at the statewide level for a long time, more than 20 years. You had Prop 110 last year, right?
Yeah, and the challenges associated with trying to get that passed. I know Steve was successful in Houston area, but I know it's been a challenge here in Colorado for us to try to get something passed. But I think part of the value of being able to see this list and part of the reason why Rick and I share this is not just because we've worked closely together for the last 20 years, but both of our journeys, if you will, have shown that there are things that you can do as an engineer and as a politician, as Rick has done, to be able to influence the process and make change. And then there are things that you can do that are more on as a non-elected official to still be able to influence the policy process. So much of what I've done really falls in the area of governmental affairs, or as I've been involved in various public agencies serving at that executive level of decision making, that is influencing the public policy, the elected policymakers, but also still having the opportunity as an executive within organizations to be able to change some of that policy. And so I think it's really been a great relationship between Rick and myself, because we learn from each other. And it's through that mutual respect and trust that I think we've been able to be successful in many different fronts in working and shaping transportation infrastructure public policy here in the Denver metropolitan area.
Great. Thanks, Carla. Let me move you to a little bit more. I mean, it's represented on this table in terms of both of your journeys in that engagement in the public policy arena. Rick, if you step back a moment and thought, what were your original motivations for moving out of that technical role that engineers usually play into this type of engagement, and both in terms of being involved in those activities, but particularly when you decided to run for office?
Steve, you echoed my same frustrations. I don't know when this was, but I'm pretty certain it was in the late 60s. I became fascinated with this urban renewal program, which really in Denver turned out to be almost horrific, because we started to knock down all of these heritage buildings in downtown Denver. That was stopped, thankfully, in the late 60s. But Skyline Urban Renewal, and how do you become a modern city? Well, you need a rapid transit system. So I was very, very interested in helping to provide a rapid transit system for the Denver region. And so I actually worked, you could see, well, it's not on there. Yeah, RTD in 1980, we had a vote that almost gave us a half cent to build the system, and it failed 52% to 48%. And I said, that's not going to happen again. Whatever I can do, I'm going to try to help do that and deliver a different way to travel in our region, because the private automobile is not I didn't realize it at the time, that it's not a sustainable future. But I thought, boy, that's inefficient. You spend a lot of money on the thing, and it creates a lot of noise and dirt. So let's do something different. Let's be a modern city. And Kyle, that just sort of cast the direction I was going to follow for the rest of my career.
Right, and Carl, I know you started out, in your education in the public affairs degree program or public administration program, but you made a choice to in that work to be engaged with infrastructure and the engineering work that is connected to all of that. But to do that, through that public arena or in that public arena, can you talk again a little bit about your personal motivation around this work that you've chosen?
Well, my interest has always been in communications and helping to solve problems and working our way through relationships between different and disparate groups. And then I have a passion for infrastructure. I don't really know where that passion came from. I have never had a desire to be an engineer, but I do love infrastructure, architecture, how things work, and understand the foundational element that infrastructure provides to our society, right? So I've had that passion in myself. So when it came time for me to make, if you will, sort of my decisions in going into public policy, it was really, how do I influence those, or how can I support those structures to be successful within our society? And a lot of that, what I found, especially in the world of transportation and engineering, is there's really that difficulty of translating the importance of the decisions and the process of engineering to people who make decisions at the elected and the appointed level. And so I found a niche for myself, not only to be able to use my communication skills to support that process, but I really believe in much of what our engineering partners, or what I consider to be my engineering partners in the variety of positions that I've held, to be highly credible and an important voice. And so my goal is to try to help make sure that those voices are heard, or that I can help represent them through the process.
All right. Good. Rick, I wonder, how has, if you think of this journey, that table of 20 plus years, plus then previous, the prior experience, how has that engagement in the public policy arena made you a better engineer?
It's given me a lot more patience. I have to say that. It provided insight to that chart that Steve showed, where there's maybe two people that think in a rational, logical pattern that are then in a legislative body. I found that I was able to offer people a summary of the pros and cons, to do that in a reasoned manner. And as people have talked about, you got to establish credibility kind of one act or one drop at a time. And as an engineer, I know that when I work on projects, that credibility goes into, I call it the credibility jar, one drop at a time. But if I mess up and I knock the jar over, all that credibility spills out. I can set the jar back up and start to add to it again, but it's going to take a while to do that. So establishing that credibility, that does lead to that trust and that is granted to you. So I tried to be very reasoned, not polarizing, and looking for the solution that's in the best interests for health, safety, and welfare.
Okay, thanks, Rick. Carla, I wonder, a different question to you that, you talked about, how you have really, tried to, provide an important part in that collaboration with engineers to get things done from a communication standpoint, and the other things that you've brought to the table in terms of your capabilities. What, when you think about those engineer partners, or, not just the ones you're currently working with, but other engineers that might be wanting to step up to a deeper engagement with regard to public policy, what do you think, if you had to point to a particular set of skills or things that those engineers should be personally learning in order to be more effective in the public policy arena or that realm, are there particular things that you think, boy, if they learned that stuff, if they knew how to do that, their effectiveness would go way up?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things, and they may not be what you would expect. But I feel very strongly that if you're going to be effective in this process and want to step up and are willing to serve, have respect for the process. Because it is not for, if you will, engineers to come forward and say, I'm going to go and change the legislative process or change the congressional process. It's how do I work effectively within the processes that exist. We have constitutions and we have statutes and we have ways in which these processes are supposed to work. And we have to find ways to respect it in order to be able to be effective within it. Change in policy is different than change in politics. And I think that's important for people to understand. It's obviously something to be a good communicator and being able to get your message across. But then I think it also is a matter of being able to negotiate and to understand what is most, what's your real goal and your outcome, and can you be flexible in that? It's not 100% or zero. It's what can we get to serve the majority of good for people. right? Or the communities in which you serve. Listening and patience. It's a very rapid world in which we operate, so it sounds odd to say be patient, but change doesn't happen overnight, and you have to be in it for the long run. You have to play the long game in order to be able to be successful in the process.
Great. Yeah, and I think that long game is really represented in that table. That is, you know, my you know, the impression that that table communicates is that both you and Rick have been, you know, engaged in that long game. You can't see it as just a one-off thing.
And one comment with regards to this Prop 110, we were not successful in the passage of Prop 110. But what was most fascinating is it took us 20 years to get to agreement to put that proposal forward. So in our group of coalition members around putting forward a transportation proposal, we could not get past ourselves because we wanted it appeared, the perfect policy, the perfect agreement, the most reasonable amount of funding, right? Or even agreement on the funding source. So the search for the perfect kept us from getting forward. Although we lost Prop 110, I can personally considered it a huge success because I served as policy director for the Move Colorado, not Move Colorado, but the Prop 110 campaign. It was a huge success because we got past ourselves, right? We got to a point where we could agree on something enough to be able to put it forward. We couldn't get past the public because we didn't spend enough time on educating the public, but we at least got past one stage, and we need to go back again.
All right. So Rick, I mean, what would you offer sort of from the inside, being an engineer engaged in public policy? What you know, advice in terms of what do engineers, you know, need to learn to be effective? You did speak to patience earlier. Anything else that you would put on the table?
It's a partnership. You have to look for a whole rainbow coalition in order to move forward. And Carla just mentioned that, the Prop 110 group. I found that the Denver Metro Chamber is a very, very good group to help us with that. They're very engaged in civic and community interests. You talked about the Metro Mayor's Caucus. It actually is an example that people come from around the country and they marvel at the fact that we're able to come together as now there's about 46 mayors that come together, and we talk about regional issues and what's important for the region, balancing that against what each city needs to do. So it's a good forum, and it's a different conversation that leads to understanding and partnership.
All right. So just some final, you know, as we wrap up, just some final thoughts or insights that you'd like to share as we wrap up, some lessons learned?
Yeah,
Sure.
These are some lessons learned that we thought would be really important for people to be able to think about, and really trying to put your biases aside as we think about these things in order to be most effective, or a way to be effective within this process. Understand the game you're playing. I think it's really important as you think about the issues that you're trying to impact and those people that you're trying to influence, that you understand the game. You know who the players are, you know what the process is, you know what the timelines are. You understand that you are entering that game. They are not coming to you, if you will. They, being a legislative body or a congressional body or your city council, or quite frankly, your homeowners association, understand the game you're playing. We've talked a lot today also about knowing the difference between policy and politics, right? You can have the best policy, but be clear about what policy it is that you're trying to articulate, and then understand the politics around what it's going to be necessary to get that passed. Sometimes it's negotiation, sometimes it's phasing in, sometimes it's looking at it from a variety of different perspectives, and building coalitions. So knowing that and understanding that is important. Seeking to understand the interrelationship between issues for policymakers. I think Rick can probably speak to this, and certainly Steve in the role that they've played, but oftentimes policymakers are faced with a variety of issues that they are trying to balance. And it's important to be able to understand what the dependencies are between issues. We may be talking about infrastructure, but there's also education and healthcare and immigration and COVID-19, whatever it happens to be, there are dependencies and competition between those issues. And so understanding those will help you in your unique situation or your unique environment, I think will help to make to make those issues even more, your influence even more effective. Another part of that, I think, is understanding the budget and the funding. I always say follow the money, right? Know where those decisions are made, where, how much funding is identified, where the funding comes into play, what process it takes for you to get in line with that funding, are all, I think, very important things to think about. Be mindful of unintended consequences. Oftentimes, I think people, and this is not unique to engineers or scientists, I think it's just people who enter the process, they push a particular agenda and they don't necessarily think about how it impacts something else. It speaks a little bit to those dependencies. And sometimes the good that you may be trying to do on an environmental front can be very damaging to people of color or underrepresented groups. So I think it's really important to be able to think about that as you're pushing things forward. Understand your audience. I think this is one of those situations where if you are going to, you're either you're going in to talk to an elected official or a policymaker, or you are in fact a policymaker and going in and talking to a public group. Understand who it is you're talking to. What are their interests? What are their backgrounds? What are the issues that they have pushed and prioritized in the past? And then strategize your message. Oftentimes we revert back to, this is what I want to say, and this is the point that I want to get across. Well, if your audience is not in a position to be able to receive that message, then it becomes ineffective. So really think about both how much time you have, and I know I need to be cognizant of the time we have here just today, but make sure you're always doing that. And then I also always say, have a plan B. If you don't get through the first time, then go back, regroup, and hit it again.
All right.
Never give up.
Good. Any final thoughts as well on your part, Rick?
No, that's why I've worked with Carla for 20 years. She always puts the right capsule on top of everything.
Very good. All right. Well, we just got a couple moments or a couple minutes. Any questions or comments by any of the participants in the Change Lab? If we can stop the screen share, that's great. For any of the provocateurs, not just Carla and Rick, but going back to George and Steve as well. Comments, questions by participants for our provocateurs? Yes,
Kyle,
Rick.
I want to go back to Steve's point about the very small number of engineers that are engaged in elected positions. I asked, this goes back to the mid-90s. I was frustrated with transportation funding, and the company I worked with was headquartered in Minneapolis at the time. So I asked one of the guys that worked for us, he used to be the deputy commissioner at Minnesota DOT. I said, Doug, why do we have this lack of understanding and influence? And he said, well, we just don't take the time to do it. And he drew a comparison to Minnesota teachers who found that they were not being represented appropriately at the state legislature, and they had a conscious effort to go get elected. And because of that, they were able to then influence policies that were more in line with supporting education. And that lesson always stuck with me, that you got to engage. And so the messages from from many of the speakers have been engage.
All right, Clint?
I asked a question earlier, and it's kind of open to all of the provocateurs, but we've seen some recent experience, Rick and Carla, with people that put engineering practices into play before policy is established. I can think of autonomous vehicles. I can think of Uber. I can think of Bird, where engineering applications just ended up showing up on the street. Sometimes getting policy around something that doesn't yet exist is hard for elected officials to understand. Is there some value to putting something into practice before you challenge somebody with policy?
Yeah.
Well, Clint, that's going to happen. And in the case that you talk about, the private sector is always going to try to pick off the low-hanging fruit, and because they're a lot more flexible, they're more adaptable, and they can move more quickly. That doesn't mean that that's bad, but when you get 500 line scooters dumped on your downtown streets, that's a problem. In Denver, again, this is coming together, the 3 primary transportation agencies, Colorado DOT, DRCOG, the MPO, and RTD, along with the chamber representing the private sector, they put together something called Mobility Choice Blueprint, which was to address the way technology is changing the way people consume transportation. It's because of this thing that they have now a whole range of choices that we as transportation planners and engineers had never really understood or planned for. So the blueprint comes together and says, here are 34 tactical actions that these partners need to come together and work on, so that we've got a framework where the private sector and the public sector can be successful in that part of our infrastructure responsibility. There are other regions that have done similar kinds of work, but each department, the state DOT, the county DOT, the MPO, they've all done their own plans, but they didn't come together to put those together in a unified program. So I think you gotta get on top of stuff because it's gonna happen.
Well, let me reframe Clint's question for maybe George or Steve. You might want to comment on this, but George, it seems to me in Clint's question, there's the trouble that we have in that I suspect public policy and technology are asynchronous. That technology is running 100 miles an hour, and public policy is, a slow machination that maybe it's running 10 miles an hour. I don't know, maybe that's not right. But what do you think about, how does public policy work? And what challenge does that present to engineers in that asynchronous relationship? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I don't think you want it any other way. I think if we try to do it the other way around, we wouldn't be where we are today. Now, I'll give you the exact opposite example of that, and that's Ma Bell. When they made the policy to break up Ma Bell, I was terrified. But by golly, we did it, and we wouldn't have what we have today if we hadn't done that. So I think there are times when public policy can lead, and there are times when science and technology can lead. But I frankly would rather have science and technology leading.
So I'll give you an example. When I was on council, this was when Uber and Lyft were showing up to the city. And we did not have any policy to accommodate for these transportation networks. And it was a direct threat to the taxi industry. And yet the taxi industry had a very strong political foothold in the city of Houston. And you're going to always have the challenge of technology versus policymaking. And as Rick had said earlier, you have to have patience. Policy takes time. And sometimes technology is going to dictate the time frame for policy to be made. What the challenge that we had, though, was we were trying to develop a policy that covered everything. And there were times where we were considering throwing out the good in pursuit of
Okay.
excellent policy.
Yeah.
And we have to be, as policymakers, be prepared to maybe do it incrementally, is address a particular issue, knowing that it's not the total solution, and be prepared to come back to that policy moving forward. And sometimes politicians have a difficult role doing that. And unfortunately, in today's world, particularly in federal and state level, the word compromise is a 4-letter word. And you know, to be honest with you, I was frustrated when I was on council over the 6 years I was on council from 2010 and 16. Over that 6-year period, the lack of government trust in federal and state migrated down to the local level. It was never that way. The city council in the city of Houston had always been nonpartisan. And then all of a sudden it started becoming a partisan. You run as not a Republican or a Democrat, you run as a candidate, but everyone has a label now. And it's really sad to see how this partisanship and lack of government trust has migrated into the local level, where you touch lives on a daily basis. And so policy takes time. And I'm not uncomfortable with technology being advanced of policy. I'm uncomfortable with the slowness of policy. And we need to try to push policy quicker.
Okay, cool. So Marilyn, you've got your hand up. We have time just for a very quick question or comment, and then I need to move into our exercise. So Marilyn?
Do you think that engineers could be their own worst enemy in this whole thing? I think it was Stu that mentioned about Rich Weingart so many years ago, the late Rich Weingart, you have to show up. And I can remember when I first started at the council in the early 90s, he pushed public relations. Tell the public what you're supposed to do. Toot your horn. He wanted people on commissions, all of the different levels, not even running for office per se, but in some of those others. I can't tell you the pushback that he got. And I wonder if there's still remnants of that you even consider those that do some of these things self-serving. So, I mean, the engineers have had a hard time being engaged, and yet I think they are actually political because they've got to deal with the city councils. They got to be in the trenches to do this. So I just kind of wonder what is that barrier that I know a lot of them say, I'm running my business. I don't have time. Obviously, the Steves, the Rick, they found and many others on this call have found the time to be engaged, but just struggling with that part of it. Thank you.
Okay, so I think I'm not going to open up that for comments by the others. We'll just allow that to be sort of a hanging question. We may be able to come back to it, towards the end of this session. But I think that's, we can all be thinking about, are we our own worst enemies? How do we engage more fully? And, follow some of the examples of the provocateurs here who have done it, in really terrific ways with terrific results. So I'm going to move over to our exercise, and let me pull up the instructions for this. It's going to be another exercise where we move into breakout groups and allow you to explore this topic. And we've set up a sort of framework for doing that, just similar to what we've done in the first 3 sessions. So let me pull up the screen share. So the idea of this, and it builds on some work that actually we started into this in Kansas City, but we wanted to take a second pass and go a little bit deeper here with regard to thinking about or using a framework where we're playing, a little bit of a role modeling game. Inside an exercise, and the setup is we'd like you to put yourselves in the shoes of Steve Costello or Rick and Carla, and that you have had this realization that you're particularly passionate about a particular public policy issue. So for Steve Costello and Edwin Friedrichs and a couple other folks, over drinks with a napkin, they decided they were particularly passionate about the question of safety and public health and welfare with regard to storm drainage and you know, the storm sewer system and the lack of spending that was happening there. You know, they picked a particular thing and then they launched into action in terms of doing that. So we want to have you put yourself in these small groups into that role, that you've decided to take up a challenge, a public policy challenge. And what we'd like you to do is to play a little bit with that, you know, moving forward. What would you do if you decided you did want to engage? And so the first thing we want you to do when you get in small group is do a little bit of a charter. Again, the roles like we've talked about in the past. Pick a particular public policy priority. Now, you can do it just in terms of something that somebody in your group is particularly passionate about, but also as some prompts. Mike, do you want to speak to these priorities? We had done some surveying both in Summit 8 and coming into Summit 9 in terms of what some of the public policy priorities were in the eyes of ECL participants. Do you want to comment on this real quick?
Yeah, at Summit 8, we devoted about an hour or so of the 40 people roughly who were there on defining priorities in public policy for the engineering community. And then leading into Summit 9, we used a survey to do the same thing, a slightly different format. But again, asking people to commit to what they feel is the highest priority public policy topic for the engineering community. And from those two efforts, you can see on the screen, now just pretty much overwhelmingly, the issue of climate change, energy policy, resilience was viewed as the highest priority among the very limited sample that took part in those two efforts. And then some of the other issues, infrastructure policy, regulatory burden, transportation policy, all had multiple mentions. And then there were another of interesting topics that were mentioned in those efforts, and you can see those there.
All right, so those are just some prompts, you know, if you're looking for a topic here, but as well, if somebody in your small group has something that they're particularly passionate about right now, you could adopt that. And so the notion is, in your small group, adopt that priority. And in your small group, we want you to go through a process of thinking about how would you advance that public policy priority, and some questions that you might explore in terms of advancing it. What are your objectives for the intervention? How might you intervene? Is it running a ballot initiative? Is it getting elected to public office so you can influence there? Is it by advocacy? A variety of different means that you might intervene. What support will you need? In Steve Costello's case in Renew Houston, some of the support they needed was advisors to tell them how to do it in terms of running a ballot initiative, or support, you know, in other means. What do you need to learn? You know, where, you know, again, we, you know, may not bring full knowledge and skill with regard to, you know, how to engage with the public policy arena. Who might your allies be, and or who might be adversaries? What roadblocks might you anticipate? And then finally, where would you start? What would be your first step? So this is a little planning exercise that we'd like you to think through using a particular instance of, you know, a public policy question that one of your small group members is particularly passionate about, or pulling from the list that Mike presented that you want to use for this exercise. You'll have about 5 minutes to get your small group organized. You'll have 30 minutes to work through your initiative strategy. And then as you complete that, we'd like you to spend the last 5 minutes in small groups just having a discussion, you know, based on the, you know, that role play, as if you were taking that forward. What insights or lessons learned would your small group suggest that we should take away and be thinking about as the Change Lab offers advice and counsel to the engineering community about how to raise our game with regard to this type of engagement. So a total of about 40 minutes in your small groups. We have our long break scheduled coming in here. So we're going to take a break before you actually start that exercise. And then we'll give you 40 minutes in the exercise before coming back to report that out to the whole group. So right now I've got, we're just coming up on the hour. So it'll be 1 o'clock Central. So let's assume that including the 10-minute break, so take 10 minutes, reconvene in your small groups at about 1:10 Central, and then you will have
12:10 Central, Kyle. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm an
Yeah.
hour off in my
Yeah.
time change there. Yeah, thanks. 12:10 Central, and then once you convene in your small group, you've got 40 minutes to do the work, and then we'll reconvene for a report out. Particularly, we'll focus. We'll have you identify what that priority question is that you chose to engage with. The key thing that we'll have you report out is the step 3 discussion, the insights or lessons learned, your collective wisdom about, how engineers can more effectively engage in public policy, glean from this exercise, but also, from your perspective that you bring in. All right?
Kyle, I think we should go with 6 rooms. A few people have
Okay.
dropped off. Is that all right with you?
Yeah, that works. So six groups. And with that, ready, set, proceed to your break. And in 10 minutes roughly, come back into your small groups that you've been assigned to. Thank you. Looks like we've got everybody back.
I think so.
Nice. All right. Well, we want to move through this report out and some discussion about, flowing out of this exercise. We'll certainly be able to weave in things that we were hearing from the provocateurs as well as we go through this. We'll go for about 20, 25 minutes here. We'll take a short break, the last of the mini breaks, and then we'll come back, talk a little bit about, that learning from the experiences on COVID and the Black Lives Matter piece, and then we'll go for some closing stuff. So report out, as I say, we want to focus on, what kind of insights, what lessons learned just from this quick exercise that we went through, imagining, you as a group engaging in shaping some policy or public policy. So group 1, what was one of the particular insights, what were you dealing with? And then what was one of the particular insights from your work? Not necessarily what you're going to do, but the insights, lessons from the exercise. So group 1, your spokesperson.
George, is that us? Are we group 1?
Yes, we're group 1.
Okay.
We're group 1. Okay. So we were looking at some of the strategies for reducing carbon based on some legislation put forth in Colorado of looking at goals of taking down emissions by 25% by 2019, 2030 was down 50%. And we kind of very quickly spiraled into a lot of very technical solutions. And then one of our members, Peggy, said, wait a second, we need to have a combination of sort of behavioral solutions and technical solutions. So we sort of backtracked, but we did that in the context of looking at energy sectors, transportation sectors, electrical production, heating, and construction industries, and tried to think about how we could affect policy from the kind of the corporation down to the individual, and come up with a series of strategies that sort of address modifications. So from there. And please, team, pipe in with some of the issues that we came up with, because I'm not sure how much of the specifics we want to get into on this. But I think some of the key points that came out were that you know, our current system of, well, actually, I want to just say something that George said towards the end of our meeting. I've never seen the sky so clear. And, you know, people have been loving the fact that in our post-COVID world, you know, we have these clear skies because we have significantly fewer people on the road, and that's a huge component of the carbon emissions. And so part of our discussion revolved around, you know, whether this post-COVID world of working at home was sustainable, and an idea that a hybrid model might be a good way to go forward in terms of having people work both in offices and at home in order to reduce some of the carbon emissions of all the cars on the road. Let's see. Team, what am I forgetting?
I think the big thing for me, I've been rolling around this a long, long time, and we always look for technical solutions. And I think COVID has shown us that we can change our behavior. And we didn't want to, but we did change our behavior, and it's working out okay. So there are some things that maybe we can push on there on the behavioral side that we hadn't really thought about before.
You know, I just underscore that I think that's such a great lesson in the sense that engineers will tend to the technical solution, right? How can I use technology to solve that problem? And here, what you're suggesting is that engineers in the public policy arena need to give themselves license to help shape the behavior, the social side, you know, that we're dealing with, and that it's okay to move away from, you know, the strict involvement in tech, you know, using technology to solve some problem. So I think that's actually, particularly from a public policy standpoint, that's a terrific sort of lesson to take away. All right, let's go to group 2.
And David, I just gave you the ability to share your screen so that I can continue keeping notes.
All right, so this is Dan Lenzel, University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and I'm the spokesperson for Group 2. So thanks, David, for scrolling up. So the question that we were, or the initiative that we were interested in moving forward is infrastructure smart cities, but getting legislation out that would establish a pilot program to transport senior citizens to doctors' offices. So very specific and certainly relevant given the situation we're all in. So stuff's been highlighted here in salmon colored, I think. Looks like a salmon to me. Related to questions we talked about, or addressing some of the questions, excuse me, to highlight some things. So one of the main objectives for this intervention would be certainly the health, safety, and welfare of senior citizens. We certainly talked about being able to serve underserved groups with something like this, and really have the public develop more of a comfort level in association with technology in this space. And certainly another objective would be to save money for those individuals who would take advantage of this, and really money broadly speaking. So how would we intervene? We had a somewhat limited list here, but we were thinking of a demo project. You know, I think we identified intervention as how would you do something that would jolt people's thinking, I believe, in relation to this particular initiative. So demonstration project, identifying individuals who'd be willing to support and promote this initiative, right? and do it in a way where the current norm, whatever that is these days, is not disrupted dramatically. From a support
So Dan,
yeah.
let me flag you away from too much detail in terms of you know, how you answered all those questions, and more to cut to, you know, what, you know, after having done that, what were some of the big, you know, what were insights or takeaways that as a group you identified at the end?
I can't do academic. I have to talk a lot.
Okay.
I can't really comprehend or do. So I guess our big, you know, if we want to scroll to the bottom, you know, one of the takeaways we had was that it's we really have to be cognizant about the regulatory domain in relation to this particular initiative, policy initiative. So understanding the regulatory framework is very, very important to us. And would certainly be something that we need to consider. Scroll down a little bit more, Dave, or are we done? Okay. Yeah, the other thing was, as highlighted there in salmon, is how would we be able to fund this in a fashion that would not increase taxes, given how that's viewed. Another takeaway from this whole thing, and this is something that I stated, but I think the rest of the group agreed, was that if you look at our lists, there's a lot of crossover there in terms of questions. So it's hard to, like, you know, a lot of these things, a lot of these questions that we asked ourselves, there's answers that would fit into multiple buckets, address multiple questions. So,
sure.
And that's not a bad thing. So now I'm done.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. Well, I would just reinforce that, you know, that sense of, you know, needing to be really knowledgeable about the regulatory framework. In your case, I was struck, Steve Costello, one of the suggested readings, and, you know, coming into this session was The Power Broker, which is this great book by Robert Caro that talks about Robert Moses in New York and his experience and things like that. And one of the things that, you know, when you read that book, well, you know, Caro makes a big point. One of the things that made Moses so effective in terms of his ability to shape, you know, just this huge program of infrastructure and the development of not just New York City, but the whole region, was the fact that Moses became an expert with regard to legislation and the legislative process and the ability to actually write that stuff. Now, he comes from a non-public affairs background, but he realizes that that's the key in terms of him, you know, him being able to be effective. So I just underscore that notion. Sometimes we got to learn these new things, whether it's the regulatory framework or the legislative process, how the bills actually get written or whatever, if we're going to be successful in this realm. So thanks for that. Group 3, key insights, lessons, you know, once you identify, what were you working on?
Yeah, so our group was focused on the infrastructure funding and kind of shifting the paradigm there, as was discussed previously through all of this, about kind of shifting to that pay-as-you-go approach, and just looking at how do you fund these kinds of initiatives, especially with trying to change infrastructure. And so we were going through and talking about how this might apply to public safety and different aspects, but really, like, kind of the key objective of all of it was to help governments make these sophisticated decisions about what to prioritize with respect to minimizing risks. And so we were really talking about, where does this support come from? How do you pull this all together? How do you start these kinds of things? So that way you can really create new sustainable funding paradigms, essentially. And some of the really big takeaways that I especially pulled, and I think a lot of our group pulled, was really pulling from Edwin's experience in Houston and talking about the different numbers, how vast the sheer size of the stakeholders, their different perspectives and needs. And especially something that came out of it was the range of adversaries that you can encounter as you're trying to kind of create these initiatives that you face, and all of their different perspectives, the questions that they're going to ask you, and how do you respond to all of that. And really talking about getting all of the stakeholders to come to the table and hopefully negotiate compromise. That way you can keep things moving forward. You're going to encounter these different adversaries at different stages, so you have to prepare and really make sure that everyone is involved early, that you get that buy-in and can keep moving forward. Group 3, if there's anything else I missed, feel free to hop in.
No, I think that's a great point in terms of that. You know, if you're going to engage in public policy arena, the notion that there are going to be these multiple stakeholders, and that identifying not only who are your allies, but who are your adversaries, and how do you engage with those adversaries in order to be able to move forward and deal with them in a constructive way is so important. So thank you for that lesson. Group 4. Thanks, Zach. Group 4. Do we recall who the spokesperson was from Group 4?
It's Doug Reed, and it looked like, oh, there he is.
Doug needs to unmute. Unmute. There we go.
Thanks, Doug.
Sorry about that. Okay, I was over on the looking at the workbook, not my video screen. Okay, so we had a terrific discussion. We chose to talk about public transit. Public transit that's always had a tough time with funding and customer satisfaction, but in particularly in the COVID times with the lack of ridership, it's really difficult for them. So we decided to talk about that, and recognizing besides COVID that Uber and Lyft have been creating some impact, and in some communities the use of scooters is even competing with it as well, and bikeways and pathways and so on. So the objectives for intervening was to, recognizing that there are many different ways for people to be mobile, from vehicles and bike lanes and pedestrian ways that all mostly focused at easing congestion and helping people to get around. The consequences of working from home were also leading to even less congestion and pollution, such that congestion may not be really that much of a driver for public transportation as it was.
So again, Doug, rather than the details of your analysis, which I appreciate, we got in the workbook, really, if you could jump to, if you had to identify one or two key insights that are about this process of thinking about how you could intervene with regard to public policy, that's where I want to go in these report outs.
Okay, good. So that's the next item on the list. So first of all, is certainly wanted to pull together people of like interest, starting with find out the groups that already are there, focused on both the topics to help sort of preserve the purpose of public transportation, but also those that oppose it, and find a critical mass. We thought different generations, groups representing Gen Y, for instance, groups representing the suburban areas, not just the metropolitan areas would be important, and any type of regional agencies, planning agencies, city councils, and so on would be ways for us to be able to create perspectives and communicate that perspective. We found that in terms of support, we need to identify those that influence public transit, both local, media, politicians, people who are high profile like athletes and entertainments, people who are respected and who public listens to. So that's the kind of support we'd like to get or to be able to leverage. And then in terms of what we needed to learn, certainly with COVID, we need to understand what the more lasting impacts will be. When we look at the day when it's post-COVID, we have a sense that there'll be permanent changes in mobility patterns. So we need to understand what those are likely going to be. And particularly looking at the interconnectivity of various transit systems, such as vehicle traffic, public transit users, bicyclists, pedestrians, and scooters, and really know how the population might use them in the future, both in terms of what they're used to having, but also what if we change the availability of those methods, how they might respond. We also needed to understand where the adversarial people are as well. So car dealers and automakers maybe not really be so supportive of public transit. The oil and gas lobby might be against this. So, and those that are hardcore, just we want bike lanes and pedestrian ways, might not be so in favor of public transportation. So we need to understand that. And,
All right.
And the conflicts between those. So that's
Okay.
Pretty much what we're doing.
Okay, so again, I mean, you had similar to the last group that sense of adversaries and allies, needing to understand those and figuring out how are you going to work successfully with those different groups or different parties, as well in your work. There, you know, I think that emphasis on finding out who are the influencers around that particular issue that may not be obvious. You know, and so you may have to ask people who the influencers are. It's 2 or 3 steps to identify those people, and then how do you engage them and bring them into this process?
Right.
So it's like, you know, it's almost like a marketing business development sort of routine that design professionals might engage in. But, you know, finding those influencers so you can bring them in, and then it sounds like in your work this idea of establishing a coalition where you've got those allies and influencers, et cetera, in a broader coalition in order to get things done. All right, great job. Group 5.
Yeah, this is Carlene. We had group 5. So we decided to focus on infrastructure policy and funding, and specifically improving the condition of critical infrastructure through maintenance and system enhancement. So not a super sexy topic, but we thought it was pretty important. And then we focused on surface water, so mostly stormwater. And so some of our objectives was really to raise an awareness of the need for funding for critical maintenance issues. And like Lauren mentioned, we wanted a Flint type awareness without, you know, putting anybody at risk. It wasn't too long ago, well, I guess it was now, 2013, where we had all those floods in Colorado. So not too far back in the public memory. So we thought the first step would be a public education program to show what can happen when critical infrastructure is not properly maintained, kind of a grassroots focused. One focused on the public and education of the public, and then one focused on policymakers. And we came up with, you know, some way to educate more is have some community outreach events, like community cleanup days, and we really liked the thought of a adopt a stream program, which would be way more fun than adopting a highway.
Okay, so again, Carlene, I'm going to have you switch more to the, to that end question about, having gone through that conversation and that exploration, what key insights did you take away, or lessons in terms of, that we can think about in terms of the public policy engagement?
Right. So the one thing we came up with is there's so many things to work on, and with the limited money and time, you need to pick one thing to focus on. And while, maintenance is not exciting, there's a impetus to increase our grade for infrastructure. And one of the main insights we had is we need to translate it to something that people are passionate about. So while, stormwater control may not be exciting, if we translate it to a way of life in Colorado, so protection of streams for fishing and recreation and lakes, those kind of things, to focus on those things that people can relate to.
Ah, nice. So, so again, your sense, boy, you got to pick a focus rather than dilute your effort across a broad range of things. Pick a focus. And then after you've picked it, you're also going to have to communicate it in a way that engages the public and, in a way that speaks to their passion or their interests, or from a communication standpoint.
Right.
Nice. Group 6.
Sorry, I was typing 2 more notes there. So Group 6 decided to tackle the difficult or multifaceted issue of racial inequalities and infrastructure policy. Try and give a voice to that. And it was quickly pointed out that it's a hard topic to grasp, just because there's so much other non-technical stuff that engineers have to grapple with. But the spear point of that was community engagement for the most part. We talked a little bit with Carla Perez and her experience with an interstate in Colorado, and a school and a community that was affected by the construction of a bridge in particular, and how they had a school that would have to move. But they brought that need to the attention of the engineers too late in the process, and missed out on some of the critical pieces that would have moved their community forward and made it a positive experience instead of a negative experience overall. So it's a key insight is that it's critical to engage with these communities very early on and very clearly with evidence-based examples. Social media, of course, allows, especially during COVID, people to communicate all over the place, but we heard a little bit over the past 2 days about how there's some misinformation. A lot of people view that as dicey information, dicey statistics. So it's still critical to maintain the evidence and integrity that we have as engineers by making sure that our solutions and propositions are fact-based.
Well, it sounds like in your lesson that you're talking about there that you're coming back to the trust factor that was so clear with regard to the provocations, and that how do you build trust and do it early before and one of the key ways you're going to do it is that engagement with the community that you're suggesting, and part of that is going to be to build trust. Bring forward that evidence as a way of not just persuading somebody, but building trust to offer them, the benefit of the evidence that you can bring to the table, and then allow them to change their hearts and minds. Does that seem right?
I don't think we quite got that far, but I think that's a good. Yeah, I think that makes sense.
All right. Well, good reports. What I'd like to do. From a time management standpoint, I'd like to take a 5-minute mini break. So it's 1:15, I believe, Central. So we'll come back at 1:20, and then we'll have some general discussion. Just we can build on what Eric was just offering from Group 6 in terms of that link to work that we were doing yesterday with regard to the Black Lives Matter discussion and some of the thoughts about public policy there. We can link into other, thoughts about the COVID situation as the previous group that was talking about the public transit was as well beginning to do. So we can, move into some of those discussions, and then in about 1:30, 1:35 or so, we'll move into some of our closing work that we want to do before we end the session. So just a 5-minute break. We'll come back at 1:20, please. Thank you. Okay, I think in the interest of time, let's go ahead and proceed. And just open it up for general discussion, both related to the exercise, but also related to that notion of learning from our experiences over the last couple months with regard to the pandemic and also the Black Lives Matter anti-racist movement as we were discussing yesterday. Thoughts, comments by anyone?
Dave, I want to maybe bring up something. We were kind of talking in the realm of kind of inherent biases, and maybe kind of turning the tables on things and saying, what are the inherent biases that the public has in dealing with engineers? And is there anything, you know, we can sort of do to prepare ourselves in dealing with going into a group of people and you're introduced as the engineer and immediately they're thinking, okay, this person has preconceived notions about things. How do we, you know, sort of prepare ourselves to overcome the inherent biases that probably people have about folks in engineering?
Yeah, sort of overcoming those stereotypes at the start that might be present in that form of bias.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
This is Mike, Kyle. I had a thought on the Black Lives Matter, and it correlates with the topic that Group 6 chose just a minute ago. And relating it to yesterday, that building, all of us are in the private sector, I'm now in both, but are committing to building diversity in our workforces and doing more, but that is a long-term proposition. Whereas shifting the policies that have to do with infrastructure and relate to racial inequalities is an action we can take in the short term that can have an impact. Policies take, I'm not saying policies move quick, but it is something we can move on that is really a definite action that can be taken.
Yeah, as you say that, Mike, go ahead, Darshan.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in there and build off of what Mike was saying and hopefully tie together some of the topics that have come up last week and this week, particularly as it relates to diversity and equity and inclusion. So I think one thing that research is showing is that different groups of people, different kinds of people come into engineering for different reasons. Research is showing that, for example, women, minorities, Native Americans, and so on, come into engineering with more of an ethos of wanting to study engineering to do something good for society, whatever that means. Turns out that a lot of these people are driven out of engineering given the inherent cultures that exist in engineering. So I think that says to me that there's a couple issues. One is that the kinds of problems that we consider to be engineering problems or hardcore problems that engineering can solve are not necessarily the kinds of problems that other people feel are the right kinds of problems that engineering needs to be focusing on. So a lot of people, like African Americans and Native Americans, research is showing, will enter engineering wanting to do something of service in their communities and then realize that actually being a lawyer will have a larger impact on their communities than being an engineer. So I think there are very, very different perceptions about what the value of engineering is to marginalized communities, and creating a space where minorities and women can actually articulate problems in different kinds of ways, I think will allow for the retention of women and minorities and lead to a more, I guess in the end, maybe a more socially responsible profession in the end.
All right.
Darshan,
Thank you, Darshan.
can I build off that?
Sure, go, Laurie.
I love your comments. I loved everything about this event. Rosa yesterday mentioned a speaker by the name of Brian C. Lee. I can post some of his presentations to the side because at the large firm roundtable of the AIA, people were asking the same kinds of questions, like it's going to take a long time to build up more people with more diverse backgrounds into the profession. What can we do now to make a difference? And his suggestion was fascinating. He said, when you have a project anywhere, go into that community, offer to hire, especially the elders in the community. They might be retired, they might have more time. Put them literally on the payroll, an amount per hour, to help you understand a community. But then also, it shows the younger people in that community, oh, hey, these people aren't so bad. Maybe I want to be an architect or an engineer. So it's a twofold. It's the community engagement. And one of you had an example yesterday about how many meetings they had with a community until to rebuild the trust. That might have been today, but I think there was some. So you do two things. You do the community outreach instead of coming in with a platter and saying, here, this will be good for you. You're actually engaging people and listening with cultural competency to different ways of thinking about communities. And you're also showing a whole new generation of kids maybe, oh, this is something maybe I want to do. This affects the built environment. So that was his number one thing, was getting cultural competence through engaging directly with the community. And I thought it was practical and doable. And even if not on an RFP, he said, put it in there anyway. It'll make a huge difference. Just his advice.
Yeah, or was it, I think, was Rosa raising the notion of intercultural intelligence?
Yes.
In her discussion yesterday.
Yes, and different communities, different cultures, different groups solve problems in different ways, and we kind of go in with this is the way we're going to solve this problem. It'll be good for you, without really understanding different groups of people are going to interact with you in different ways.
All right. Anyone else? So let me ask a different question and have you react to it, or if you have thoughts about that. And that's, you know, in the workbook there was this question, you know, what could, you know, the engineering community do to support the development of the capacity of engineers to engage like this in the public policy arena? What, you know, how do we develop these skills, capacities, foster that, and or, you know, not just the engineering community, but what could or should the Engineering Change Lab US be doing about that? Do you have, you know, do people have any thoughts, advice and counsel about, you know, that? How do we build the capacity to do this more fully? Any thoughts on that?
Hey, Kyle, somebody mentioned, I think it was Rick, was talking about being co-chair of the chamber. I found that chambers of commerce are extraordinarily valuable resources. If you join the chamber, you can join committees, you can get engaged on all these things like the legislative policy councils. They give you a lot of chance to learn and grow and meet with other people in a non-commercial setting, more of an advisor. And I just think it's an underused resource.
Great idea. Great idea. Mark Abbott.
Yeah, I happened to be on a call last night. There's a consultation underway by the World Federation of Engineering Organizations and the International Engineering Association to look at the graduate attributes and professional competencies frameworks that are used kind of globally to help, you know, with mobility of engineers between different countries and to kind of evolve engineering. And I think there's a set of the question on competencies and what's kind of required going forward. It looks like there's some good progress that's supposed to be made in terms of updates to some of those documents. But the challenge I see when you read them is, depending on what your underlying belief of what engineering is, you can read the exact same attributes and competencies in a very different way. And a lot of the actual definitions are kind of self-referential. It's like, well, you're engineering to about applying engineering principles and engineering fundamentals. And I think in practice, those get interpreted very narrowly as, you know, well, engineers just put their head down and build stuff. and all of the sort of social things aren't real engineering. And I think that's a big drag on sort of participation in engineering. That's why I think rightfully a lot of people aren't excited about being in engineering, because I don't just want to put my head down and create things. I want to interpret engineering in a bigger way than that.
All right, good. Further thoughts, Stu? Oh, you're muted, Stu, if you can unmute yourself.
I'm sorry. Mark, you mentioned competencies. I don't know if this is the same thing, but there's been a movement in the US in the last two decades for engineering disciplines to develop formal bodies of knowledge. Does that connect with, I think that connects with competencies. The idea here is to define the knowledge, skills, and attitudes desired by someone who is going to enter into professional practice as a civil engineer, mechanical engineer, chemical engineer, and so on. And then use that to urge educators and practitioners to set up formal education, and in the case of licensed engineers, pre-licensure experience that'll help candidates achieve that. It's sort of a begin with the end in mind approach. I'm very familiar with its use in civil engineering, and it has had a tremendous impact on the educational system of civil engineers already. It's very common among professions, bodies of knowledge. It's sort of the fabric that holds them together. My thoughts.
Thanks, Stu. Well, actually, we had a great example of that notion of a competency model, as you know, expressed there in Cindy Gilbert presenting what I would characterize as, you know, their framework for environmentally responsible engineering. That's part of their you know, that effort to build environmentally responsible engineering into the fabric of the engineering education across the country, and that circular model with all of its pieces, you know, is definitely a competency model. And you know, we just focused on the leadership side of it, but yeah, you know, having that perspective in terms of what's the broader set of competencies required to engage fully and proactively in public policy could be there. Any other? Let's see, Dan Lenzel.
Yeah,
and Mark as well.
Okay.
Okay.
I want to go before Mark, if that's all right, because you always make me look.
I think we got Mark taken care of in his in the previous comment. So go, Dan.
I think one of the things, you know, that I always struggle with, because we're trying to do similar, you know, we're trying to reform academia, reform curricula. Certainly bodies of knowledge are extremely important there so that we can stay accredited and all that good stuff. We always run into how are people credited for doing these additional things, that be they students who are pursuing a degree, be they faculty or initiating new things. And I think, and I don't personally, I think you should want to do it. It should be intrinsic desire to do things, which we've talked about during the summit. But that's always a stumbling block, and unfortunately, and in relation to kind of becoming more active and making people more aware of what engineers really can do and the talents that we do have and the talents that we're continuing to grow. I think in terms of what this group could do would maybe potentially establish some way for the bosses, I guess, to figure out how do I ascertain that this activity, if it's cutting into my employees' time, is valuable to my bottom line, but also valuable to the community at large. Again, you should want to do it, and we've listened to multiple individuals who have done it of their own accord, but I think that's something that maybe we could help with. I don't know.
All right, thank you. Well, I think I'm going to close off the conversation at this point in terms of that working on the public policy arena, and move into a close for the summit. Really, from the standpoint of looking at the work that we've done over all 4 days, We wanted to, in the Ideas Summit, have an opportunity to go more in depth in 4 particular areas that we've been working on, acknowledging that, even 4 hours is not really enough time to go into depth about any of these topics. They could all merit much more work, and hopefully we'll be able to continue to do some of that work within the Change Lab, but we'll also, have various people that have been part of the session doing that work as part of their own practice and their own leadership activities. The technological driving forces, but particularly that notion of the entanglement that we started with on last Wednesday, and exploring that in different ways with the provocateurs that we had there. Moving to on Thursday, looking at the leadership for environmentally responsible engineering, and how you could build that capacity not just through the work that Lemelson VentureWell is engaged in at the university level, but you could begin to build and express that capacity in practice to make a major contribution to society by doing that. Yesterday, looking at the diversity, inclusion, equity, I guess I should reorder that with justice into that JEDI acronym that Rosa was offering. And, what are the challenges around that, but also what are the opportunities if we were able to make a significant difference with regard to that and unstick the system. And then moving into our discussion today, which is, really trying to promote and develop the capacity in the engineering community to more fully engage in public policy, rather than simply being seen as technical experts that get consulted in terms of providing some of that evidence, perhaps, and or are implementers in terms of doing the technical work once the public policy has been decided. So those were really the major, the major pieces that we wanted to try and accomplish in this session. We will note in terms of next steps, we had shifted, as those of you that are veterans to the ECL effort, we had shifted away from trying to do 3 summits a year, so we were doing them every 4 months. We decided that what we would do is change the process in 2021, where we do this longer Summer Ideas Institute, where we've had 2 full days. And then we had, pre-COVID, we had decided to do a 1-day symposium that was associated with that, which dropped out, but we would at some point like to be able to return to. And then we would have 6 months later, a shorter version, which would be more similar to the 1.5-day summit that we've been holding previously. That is still our intention, I think, which would put it into late January, February, in terms of when we'd be coming back together in person. Although we haven't picked the absolute dates, and we're still going through a process of sorting through what the possible content would be. I think, Mike, it would be fair to say that we'll probably be able to make a decision about both dates and content by sometime in September.
Yes, that would be my goal.
Okay. The steering committee needs to get together and, make some decisions around that. As well, we've got various initiative groups, the licensure group and, work around public policy, other education group. Those initiatives, at some level are still proceeding, but they've been, I think interrupted by the COVID process. We actually had work that we're going to facilitate, like on licensure, later in August at the NCEES annual meeting that has been deferred. But we definitely, again, as we move out of the COVID experience, we want to make sure that we can re-engage some of that initiative work and move forward with those things. Anything else in terms of next steps, Mike?
No, well, yeah, I will be sending out probably tomorrow a post-summit survey. So appreciate it if you could give me some feedback. That would be greatly appreciated, and we'll take it into account.
All right, with that, I'd like to see if we can do just a quick round robin. If everyone is fairly brief in their comments, we can probably check in with almost everyone personally rather than move to a breakout to process that. So what I'd like you to do is just, a quick comment. How are you feeling at the end of this 4 days? If you've been involved in 4 days, or if it's only been 1 day, how was that experience for you? But do that briefly. And then, what's one particular major learning that you're taking away from this summit, the Ideas Institute, the work that we've done over these 4 days, or those portions that you were involved with? And, I'll just see if I can manage and get everyone through that. Eric, can I put you on the spot? Or I tell you what, let's not do it that way. I'll give you all about 30 seconds to answer those questions in your mind before I call on people. So, overall sense of how you're doing at the end of this experience, and 2, what was a key takeaway for you personally? And at this point, who'd like to go first? I'm going to try and hear from all of you, so round robin. Yeah, George, thank you.
Yeah, I've always been proud to be an engineer, but I'm really proud to be part of this team because of the way you're dealing with the social implications of this, especially around racial equity. I'm just really proud of that.
Thank you, George. Next. Okay, Rick.
Well, as engineers, we're all problem solvers. It's kind of like the carpenter that walks around with a hammer, always looking for a nail. So I tend to look at problems, and I'm encouraged to know that others are looking for solutions here to these kinds of subjects. And I would say that the partnership that we all share can go forward a long, long way.
All right, thanks, Rick. Victoria, and you'll need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I thought this was a really good experience to hear some of the conversations and other opinions. And I think the thing I'm walking away is that we need action. That being the engineering voice isn't going to help public policy if we don't step up.
All right, thank you. Ching?
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway for me was yesterday's equality session, the JEDI engineering. That was really nice. But of course, all the public policy today, because that's important for my government side of the work. But all the conversations, provocations were really amazing, just like last year. And I think Mike and you, Kyle, did a great job even in the virtual format. And the bell ringing was the best.
All right. Thanks. Dan.
So I guess first off, what Victoria said, that's my first comment. So, I think let's get things rolling. I'm getting antsy, even though we've made a lot of progress and really in the grand scheme in a short period of time. And I guess, the takeaway from this, as typically is the case for me with all the summits, is that there are so many people trying to do great things in this space that we call engineering. And I still feel that we're just scratching the surface, but I think ECL USA, the fact we've been able to bring people together to have these conversations really positions us to be a repository for this information, a conduit where other people can have this experience.
Thank you. Others, hands up.
That's Bob Sims. I'm sorry.
Okay. No, go ahead.
It's Bob Sims. I was particularly impressed with the discussions yesterday and the real interest and enthusiasm over diversity and inclusion. We do need to do a lot more in the engineering profession in that area, and I was glad to see so much interest in that.
Thanks, Bob. Lauren?
Yeah, similar to what just Bob said, I really enjoyed Rosa's presentation about equity by design, because I think there were some real tangible things that I could take back to my company and implement. And then Kyle, this one of the things, because I keep coming back to what a messy bunch of problems, wicked problems we've tried to tackle, is just your comment that, first just try to unstick the system. And that seems more doable to me.
All right. Thanks, Lauren. Mark Abbott.
Yeah, just as always, really appreciate the ECL USA community, and congratulations on the first 4 years into the virtual format. I think that went quite well. For me, coming from Canada, it's just amazing to meet new people and on the other side of the border and get a sense of the system there and kind of compare notes. I think just in general, like more and more personally and with the work up in Canada, just getting the sense of there's like an underlying challenge or opportunity, depending on how you want to look at it, in terms of which I think really is coming around questioning some of the basic assumptions of engineering. So I was really drawn to Darshan's work on the self-reflective questions that he's posing. I think are a great practical way to drill into that.
Thanks, Mark. I'm going to go to Clint first, and then I'll go to Stu and Vic, sort of in order. So Clint.
So first, once again, compliments to Kyle and to Mike for taking 4 hours in a virtual session and keeping it lively and going and connected with everybody. It's one of the better sessions. I do a lot of these, and I really appreciate the effort that you all put into this. That was really amazing.
Thank you.
I'm gonna echo what Victoria said as well, is because I think you all know that I'm a person of action, and I love the conversation, and I love driving down into the U. But along with Dan and some others, I want everybody on this call to be thinking about what is the role of ECL USA in the topics that we've had in the 4 sessions that we have, and whether we simply assimilate other associations or other leadership people in these and make them available to all engineers, or whether there's a role for us to develop something that supports all of the engineering communities. I hearken back to what Rachel said in her presentation, and I think it's particularly important, and I think I heard the other provocateurs say this as well, is this notion of self-reflection, to see where your biases are and acknowledge what those biases are. So not only trying to improve relationships with others, but see where those biases come from, and then how we can incorporate that into education models so that people can visually see and better understand their own biases. I captured all of the things you provided the other day, and it'll take some time to get through it, but some great resources. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks. Vic, Stu first.
Thank you, Kyle. Reflecting on the 4 days, this reinforced for me the effectiveness of virtual conferences. I think they're going to be here to stay in some way, shape, or form. And the virtual conference breakouts were new to me. I thought they were very effective. With respect to what I learned, I'm beginning to think that the underrepresentation of women in engineering is less an issue with trying to change the way they think and more an issue of trying to change the system. I think it's a system problem primarily. Thank you, Kyle.
All right, thank you. Let's see, go to Vic next.
Yeah, I would echo the compliments of you guys leading an excellent group of sessions here, as well as the provocateurs that you brought to us. There was a wonderful symbiotic discussion across both days. And I guess what hit me as I listened, particularly today, and where we were talking about leadership in the political arena, was the fact that in my 40 years of my career, the engineers I've worked with and around and for, a lot of smart ones, and the engineers that became leaders asked a lot more questions, and the great engineers that did not become leaders had all the answers. And therefore, they really didn't need to know any more answers. So it reminded me of some of the things I've heard today of one of Covey's habits of seek first to understand and then be understood. And I think I would echo Clint's call to action of what can we do to really bring the very passive engineering community forward to start to have an activist voice in some of the opportunities that we've found that we should have an activist voice in. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Vic. Marilyn?
I enjoyed this tremendously, and you pulled off great topics, great provocateurs. My problem is always going away with so many ideas, and I got to focus. I got to focus on picking something that is doable within, let's ACC Colorado, for instance. I'm fortunate that so many from Colorado attended these sessions over the 4 days, and we picked their brains, but definitely public policy. I like what Steve had to say. It's public policy, but it's communicating, you know, put the right words together and how they relate to public relations, how you turn self-serving into something that doesn't sound so negative. You know, so it's trying to focus and get something done, build the bench, and remember policy versus politics.
All right, thank you. Carlene? And you'll need to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. So again, some great sessions. I do not hope this is our conference moving forward, because I love being there in people and find that really energizing. So I'm excited to get back together in person. I'm kind of with Clint. I always want to take something away of, okay, what do I do next? And through all these conversations, the thing that I realized is I get frustrated when people, especially some of our younger employees, that don't see the world the way I see it. And so this has opened up my mind a little bit to look at, you know, what motivates them and what would motivate them to be more involved in community and those kind of things. And so getting down to more of that, those base values.
All right, thank you. Hands up. Okay, Darshan.
I'm wondering, since this was my first summit, if you can share a little bit about ways in which you think ECL might be able to support new kinds of initiatives that might be, and ideas that might be coming out of this group.
Are you asking that for now, or you say it in a future time or a future communication?
I mean,
because we probably don't have time for it now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just wondering, so
Yeah.
It seems like there's a lot of enthusiasm to do things with what we know. And so the question is, in what ways can ECL facilitate doing things with what we know?
Right. And we've got, you can look at the, you know, so those initiatives that we've got, I think, show up on the website. But let's just hold that question.
Sure.
Thank you, Darshan, for that. Next, who's up? Edwin.
I'm inspired. So many people want to do things, but we are pretty geographically spread out. And what I'd find is we're going to have to get some little incubator areas started, possibly in cities. So maybe we take part of this show, whichever one of them, and offer it virtually to groups that are closer together within a local community, where they can more easily carry an initiative forward that they identified, rather than us having people from the East Coast, West Coast, and Central try to get together to make an initiative happen.
All right.
It's kind of a learning.
Thank you. A few more. Let's see, Dave Sukup.
Actually, Mike and I have already talked about this, but just wanted to open it up to people who kind of are interested in an action area that we're going to be putting together the engineering societies, government agencies, industries to look at actually the K through 8 space in STEM education. That there's a lot of overlap in what a lot of us do in terms of our companies, our associations, and if we could kind of bring our resources together, kind of look at the best practices of what we are doing in the K through 8 space. I think in the discipline areas, kind of grades 9 through 12, we can kind of divert and do our own thing. And I'm going to say the best, you know, engineering discipline is mechanical engineering, and that's where we really need to do it in 9 through 12. But basically in K through 8, we're all doing a lot of stuff that overlaps with each other, and think about the resources that we could have if we didn't overlap. So if you're interested in joining this sort of initiative, you know, please let me know.
Thanks, Dave. So I tell you what, we are going to run out of time here. I promised Mike that we would reserve a few minutes for him to do a close from his perspective as well. So I'd like to just, offer maybe one or two more people the opportunity to make a closing comment, and then I'm going to move to Mike. Anybody? So anyone? Yes.
This is Carla.
Okay.
As one of the non-engineers in the group, I must applaud all of you. I think this has been a great conversation, and in true, if you will, engineer form, you have been extremely thorough. You've been extremely thoughtful. And I think what I would say is that I appreciate the fact that there's an interest and a willingness to look at partnerships, right? We can't all be experts on everything, right? But that desire for change and learning is there. So partnering with people like myself who do have that insight into what the public policy arena is like, I think can be very powerful. So thank you for the opportunity to participate.
All right, thank you very much. One more person. Or not. Okay, thanks, Eric. Got a thumb up there. All right, with that, Mike, do you want to make some closing comments from your perspective?
Okay, yeah, thank you, Kyle. And I guarantee you we'll be done here within 3 minutes. So thanks to all of you for your engagement with Engineering Change Lab. Shout out to all of you who stuck through to the very end. Very much appreciate it. And a number of those who are still with us are consistent participants in all of our summits, and I really appreciate the consistent interest in our work. Thanks to our steering committee who continue to support the vision of Engineering Change Lab. Thanks again to NCEES for their financial support. Thanks to our provocateurs who provide the thought leadership on these issues that are so important to the future of the engineering community. Remember that our vision and mission is to be a change agent, helping engineers and engineering organizations to prepare for the future and contribute at a higher level to the needs of the world. To be effective in executing that mission, we really need to expand our reach. And I ask for all your help in this. And this echoes what Edwin said. If you want to explore the future in your organizations locally, or are aware of other organizations that we should be engaged with, please reach out to me. A number of you have mentioned we've shown we can deliver this ECL programming in a virtual environment. Kyle highlighted the issues we've dealt with in the 4 sessions of the Engineering Ideas Institute. They're vitally important to the future of engineering, so I want to mention them one more time. How will we untangle and apply technology, which, as Mark Abbott always says, is really all the work we do, in more meaningful and beneficial ways? How can we take on a greater leadership role in addressing the environmental challenges that the world faces? How can we break the barriers to diversity and inclusivity in engineering such that we are not missing out on the talent and skills of half the population? How can we engage to achieve greater influence in the realm of public policy? We've seen in these 4 sessions that these issues have polarities, different views of the status quo, different viewpoints on where change needs to occur. I hope we've been able to be provocative in exploring the polarities of these issues while maintaining the respect for the views of all. And one final note of thanks, I have to thank Kyle Davey for his masterful facilitation of our work. I can testify firsthand that the key to Kyle's work is the unbelievably thorough research that he does on all these topics. This deep knowledge of the subjects, allows him to design these meaningful exercises for all of us, and also to offer great insight in guiding us along the way. So Kyle, thanks for your leadership and your commitment to our work. So thanks again,
Thank you.
everybody. I hope to see you in the future at another summit, whether it's virtual or in person. Take care, everybody, and thanks again.
Thank you.
All the best, everyone. Hope to see you in person in February or January, February, but if not, we'll make do.
Thank you so much.
All the
Good
best.
seeing you.
Thanks, everybody. Great to